The sun blazed down on the vast expanse of the Galactic military training grounds, a field teeming with soldiers from every corner of the universe. The air crackled with the hum of advanced energy weapons, firing in synchronized patterns at distant targets. High above, drone cameras hovered, broadcasting the spectacle to 1,000 worlds. This was more than a demonstration of military might. It was a display of the galaxy's most sophisticated technology. Plasma rifles hissed, ion cannons roared, and photon blades cut through the air with a deadly grace. Amidst this cacophony of power and precision, a lone figure stood apart. The Longbowman, dressed in the traditional garb of Earth's historical reenactment society, looked out of place among the sleek, armored soldiers. His tunic, worn with age, bore the simple crest of an ancient Earth clan, a stark contrast to the futuristic uniforms surrounding him. In his hand he held a simple wooden bow, a relic from a time long forgotten by most. Beside him, a quiver filled with arrows hung at his side, the feathers rustling softly in the breeze. The crowd's laughter rang in his ears, a chorus of mockery at the sight of his primitive weapon. "Look at that!" sneered a commander from the Vega system, his voice dripping with disdain. "What is this, a circus? Did Earth send a jester instead of a soldier?" Another, a tall, imposing figure from the Orion fleet, chuckled. "I hear they still use those things to hunt on Earth. It's a wonder they even know what a real weapon looks like." The Longbowman remained silent, his expression unreadable. He could feel the weight of their scorn, but he was undeterred. His fingers brushed against the smooth wood of his bow, a familiar touch that grounded him amidst the ridicule. He had trained for this moment, not to prove himself to the galaxy, but to honor a lineage that stretched back through the centuries. He was not here to defend Earth's pride, but its tradition. As the mock battle raged on, a sudden shift in the air brought a change. The sky darkened, and a low rumble vibrated through the ground. The laughter died down, replaced by a murmur of confusion. Above, the drone cameras swiveled, capturing the ominous approach of a fleet of ships. Unlike the polished, silver vessels of the galactic armies, these ships were dark, angular, and menacing. A warning siren blared, cutting through the chatter. "Attention, all units! Unknown ships have entered the perimeter. Prepare for engagement!" The voice of the command center crackled through the comms, thick with urgency. Panic spread among the soldiers as the rogue faction's ships descended, their sleek forms blotting out the sun. The galactic commanders scrambled to their positions, shouting orders, their confidence evaporating in an instant. The Longbowman watched as the soldiers raised their energy weapons, ready to fire, only to hear a collective gasp. A high-pitched hum filled the air, and the lights on their rifles flickered and died. The jamming technology had taken effect, rendering all energy-based weapons useless. For a moment, there was only silence, a stunned disbelief that swept across the field. Then chaos erupted. Soldiers fumbled with their dead weapons, their eyes wide with fear. The rogue faction's forces began their assault, descending upon the defenseless armies with brutal efficiency. Plasma grenades exploded, sending shockwaves through the ranks. The ground shook with the force of the attack, and the once organized military exercise dissolved into chaos. In the midst of the pandemonium, the Longbowman took a deep breath and stepped forward. His movements were calm, deliberate, a stark contrast to the chaos around him. He drew an arrow from his quiver, its feathered shaft whispering through the air. With practiced ease, he knocked it onto his bowstring and pulled back, the tension of familiar comfort against his fingers. His eyes narrowed, focusing on a distant target, a rogue commander directing the assault. He released the arrow, and it flew through the air with a quiet whistle, cutting across the field. It struck true, piercing the commander's armor in a chink at the neck. The figure crumpled, his orders cut short. A ripple of shock passed through the rogue ranks as they realized what had happened. Another arrow flew, and another, each finding its mark with unerring accuracy. The Longbowman moved with a grace that belied his years, his arrows striking like lightning in the storm. A murmur of awe spread among the galactic soldiers. The same commanders who had laughed at him moments before now watched in stunned silence as the Longbowman turned the tide of battle. His arrows seemed to sing through the air, a haunting melody that spoke of ancient battles and long-forgotten wars. With each shot, he carved a path through the chaos, his skill and precision leaving no doubt about his place on this battlefield. "Regroup!" a voice called out, one of the Galactic commanders now taking charge. "Form a line behind the Earth Archer." The soldiers obeyed, rallying behind the Longbowman, their fear giving way to a newfound respect. The rogue faction's advance faltered, their confusion evident as they faced an enemy they had not prepared for, one who did not rely on technology but on skill and tradition. The Longbowman's arrows continued to fly, each one a testament to the enduring power of Earth's ancient arts. As the battle raged on, the Longbowman felt a surge of pride swell within him. Not for the mockery he had endured, but for the chance to show the galaxy that sometimes the old ways were the best. His arrows flew true, and with each shot he felt the weight of his ancestors guiding his hand. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, hope began to stir in the hearts of those who had underestimated the power of a simple wooden bow. The rogue faction's forces began to retreat, their initial confidence shattered by the unexpected ferocity of the Longbowman's assault. The Galactic soldiers, now emboldened, pressed forward, their battle cries echoing across the field. And as the Longbowman knocked another arrow, his eyes fixed on the enemy's retreating form, he knew that this was just the beginning. The rogue faction's retreat had given the Galactic forces a brief respite, but the field was still thick with tension. The Longbowman's breathing was steady, his eyes scanning the battlefield for signs of the next attack. He knew better than to relax. These moments of calm could shatter in an instant. Around him, the soldiers he had saved began to regroup, their movements hurried but more organized than before. They were still reeling from the surprise, but something had shifted. Respect now mingled with their astonishment. A young lieutenant from the Altair regiment approached him, her face a mix of awe and disbelief. "I've never seen anything like that," she admitted, her voice trembling with a combination of fear and excitement. "How did you do it? How did you remain so calm while we were—" She trailed off, searching for the right words. The Longbowman turned to her, his expression serene. "The bow teaches patience," he said simply. "And clarity. In chaos, you must find your center. Focus on what you can control." He glanced at the quiver slung over his shoulder, feeling the weight of each arrow, each a reminder of Earth's ancient wisdom. "The arrow must fly true, even when the world is falling apart." The lieutenant nodded slowly, as if trying to absorb his words. Around them, the murmurs of soldiers grew louder. Some were discussing the rogue faction's tactics, while others, emboldened by the Longbowman's presence, were readying themselves for the next wave. The commanders, who had once mocked him, now conferred with renewed determination, crafting a plan that might leverage their new advantage. But not everyone was convinced. From the back of the group, a seasoned captain from the Arcturus fleet voiced his skepticism. "This isn't over," he said, his voice carrying a hard edge. "The rogue faction won't fall back for long. They've tasted our fear. Next time, they'll come prepared for your arrows." He eyed the Longbowman critically, his face a mask of doubt. "What then, Earthman? What will you do when they bring something your sticks and feathers can't pierce?" The Longbowman met his gaze evenly. "Adapt," he replied. "As we always have. They expect us to fight by their rules. We must show them we have our own." Before the captain could respond, the ground beneath them shuddered. A deep, resonant hum filled the air, growing louder by the second. The soldiers instinctively raised their weapons, though many knew they were still useless. Overhead, the sky darkened once more, and the rogue ships began their descent, this time in tighter formation. The rogue leader's voice crackled over the loudspeakers, dripping with a smug confidence that set everyone's nerves on edge. "Did you think a few sticks would make a difference, Earthman? You've only delayed the inevitable. Surrender now, and we might show mercy." The Longbowman's grip tightened around his bow. He could see the rogue ships hovering, their engines thrumming like a warning. They had regrouped quickly, adapting their strategy to counter the unexpected threat. His mind raced, calculating distances, wind speed, and the position of each enemy vessel. He knew they were waiting for him to make the first move. He reached for an arrow, his fingers brushing against the fletching, feeling the familiar texture that had guided him through countless hours of practice. Drawing the bowstring back, he took a deep breath, centering himself. Around him, the soldiers watched in silence, a collective breath held as they waited for his signal. Then, with a sharp exhale, he released the arrow. It sliced through the air with a whistle, a straight line of wood and steel headed for the nearest ship. The rogue forces, confident in their shields, did not expect the arrow to find its mark. But find it did, slipping through a narrow vent in the hull, striking something vital. The ship wobbled, its descent faltering as smoke billowed from its side. A cheer went up from the Galactic soldiers, their fear momentarily forgotten. The rogue leader's taunt faded, replaced by confusion and frustration. What did he? Regroup! The lieutenant from Altair called out, her voice clear and commanding. Focus on their weak spots. Use anything you have. The soldiers moved with renewed purpose, scavenging for any materials that could be fashioned into makeshift weapons. Some began pulling apart their disabled energy rifles, repurposing components into primitive projectiles. Others took up bows of their own, mimicking the Longbowman's technique with varying degrees of success. The field transformed into a workshop of innovation, each soldier contributing to their shared defense. The rogue ships began a new assault, their weapons firing in erratic bursts. Explosions rocked the ground, but the Galactic forces, now adapting to their situation, held their ground. The Longbowman continued to fire, each shot carefully calculated, exploiting every gap in the enemy's armor. His arrows became a rallying cry, each strike a defiance against the odds stacked against them. As the battle intensified, the rogue leader's frustration became palpable. Enough of this! He shouted. Crush them! All ships, focus fire! The rogue forces shifted, their coordinated assault bearing down on the Galactic line. The soldiers braced themselves, the weight of the onslaught pressing upon them. Yet amid the chaos, the Longbowman moved with a quiet grace, his eyes never leaving the target. He knew the battle was far from over, but he also knew something had changed. The soldiers, once divided and fearful, now fought with a shared purpose. Another arrow flew, this one aimed at the rogue leader's ship. It struck, and a burst of light erupted from the impact. The ship staggered, its systems faltering under the unexpected attack. The rogue leader's voice crackled again, but this time, there was an edge of desperation. Impossible! How are they? The Longbowman knocked another arrow, his expression focused and calm. Because we adapt, he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. And we endure. The battle raged on, but a sense of anticipation hung in the air. The soldiers, now emboldened, fought with everything they had, each moment pushing them closer to a turning point. The rogue faction, their confidence waning, began to falter, their attacks losing cohesion. The Longbowman could feel it, a shift in the tide of battle. He knew the next move would be crucial, the one that could decide their fate. And with that realization, he steeled himself, ready for whatever came next. The ground quaked as the rogue faction's ships began a relentless barrage, their projectiles tearing into the terrain and scattering debris into the air. The once organized Galactic ranks now scrambled to adapt, hastily ducking behind makeshift barricades or diving into the craters carved out by explosions. Smoke thickened, curling upwards in choking tendrils, and the acrid smell of burnt metal and ozone filled the atmosphere, seeping into every breath. The Longbowman could feel the tension rippling through the air, the weight of the battle pressing down on him like a physical force. Through the haze, he spotted a familiar figure, one of the Galactic commanders who had jeered at him before. The commander, now covered in dust and grime, was frantically issuing orders, his voice hoarse from shouting. Hold the line! Don't let them break through! His bravado had been replaced with urgency, and for the first time, a hint of fear glinted in his eyes. The Longbowman narrowed his gaze, focusing on the rogue faction's advance. Their tactics had shifted once more, becoming more aggressive, more desperate. They were pushing hard, seeking to break the spirit of the Galactic soldiers. He could see it in their movements, the way they pressed forward with a brutal, unyielding force. The rogue leader was no longer playing games. This was an all-out assault. A series of explosions erupted to his right, and he turned just in time to see a group of galactic soldiers thrown back by the blast. The screams of the wounded filled the air, a sharp contrast to the steady rhythm of the Longbowman's breathing. He knew he had to act quickly. The rogue faction was targeting their weakest points, exploiting every gap in their defenses. He drew another arrow from his quiver, the familiar weight settling comfortably in his hand. Knocking it onto the bowstring, he took a deep breath, centering himself amidst the chaos. He aimed at a rogue soldier who was directing a squad toward a breach in the barricade. The arrow flew, swift and silent, embedding itself in the soldier's chest. The rogue soldier crumpled, and his squad hesitated, momentarily thrown off balance. But there was no time to celebrate. The rogue leader's voice crackled over the loudspeakers again, sharp and filled with venom. "Is this all you've got, Earthman? You may have had your moment, but now you face a true warrior." A new ship descended from the fleet, sleeker and more formidable than the rest. It hovered just above the battlefield, and the Longbowman could feel its presence like a shadow looming over him. The hatch opened, and the rogue leader stepped out, clad in dark, ornate armor that seemed to absorb the light around him. He wielded a weapon unlike any the Longbowman had seen, an intricate blade that shimmered with an energy field, crackling with raw power. The leader leaped from the ship, landing with a heavy thud that reverberated through the ground. He raised his blade, pointing it directly at the Longbowman. "This ends now," the rogue leader declared, his voice carrying over the din of battle. "Your antiquated weaponry will not save you. Face me, if you dare!" The Longbowman could sense the shift in the air, the eyes of every soldier, both galactic and rogue, now fixed on this singular moment. He felt a strange calm wash over him, a clarity that cut through the noise and smoke. He had trained for this, for every possible scenario, every unexpected twist. And yet, standing before the rogue leader, he understood that this was more than a mere clash of weapons. It was a battle of wills, of ideologies. Without a word, the Longbowman stepped forward, drawing another arrow. The tension in the string mirrored the tension in the air, a taut line that could snap at any moment. He aimed carefully, his focus narrowing to the rogue leader's chest. But before he could release, the rogue leader moved, faster than he could have anticipated. The blade swung with a blur, and an arc of energy shot forward, slicing through the air with a sharp hiss. The Longbowman leaped aside, the energy slicing past him and scorching the ground where he had stood. He rolled to his feet, heart pounding in his chest. This was a different kind of opponent, one who combined speed and technology with a ruthless efficiency. He couldn't afford to underestimate him. "You think your arrows can match my blade?" the rogue leader taunted, his eyes gleaming with confidence. He advanced with quick, precise steps, the blade humming with anticipation. The Longbowman knew he had to change his approach. His arrows would be less effective against the energy field surrounding the rogue leader. He needed to find a weakness, a flaw in the leader's seemingly impenetrable defense. He circled his opponent, watching, waiting for an opening. The rogue leader lunged, his blade sweeping in a wide arc. The Longbowman ducked under the swing, feeling the heat of the energy pass just above his head. He fired an arrow mid-roll, aiming for the rogue leader's legs, but the leader twisted, narrowly avoiding the shot. They continued this deadly dance, each probing for an advantage. The rogue leader's attacks were swift and relentless, a flurry of motion and energy that kept the Longbowman on the defensive. But with each swing, the Longbowman noticed a pattern, a slight overextension in the leader's movements, a momentary lapse after each strike. And then he saw it, a brief flicker in the energy field, a tiny gap that appeared just after the rogue leader completed a swing. It was barely perceptible, but it was enough. The Longbowman feinted left, drawing the leader into another sweeping attack. As the blade passed by, he pivoted sharply, knocking an arrow in a single fluid motion. The arrow flew, striking through the gap in the energy field and piercing the armor beneath. The rogue leader staggered, his eyes wide with shock and pain. The blade fell from his grasp, its energy field flickering out as he dropped to one knee. For a moment, silence fell over the battlefield, the clash of weapons and cries of battle fading into a stunned hush. The galactic soldiers watched, their breaths held in collective anticipation. The Longbowman stood tall, his bow still drawn, his gaze fixed on the rogue leader. The leader looked up, his face a mix of disbelief and grudging respect. You have earned this victory, Earthman," he managed, his voice strained. "But this is far from over." The Longbowman nodded, his eyes steady. "No battle ever is," he replied, lowering his bow as the tension eased. He knew this fight had only begun, that there were still challenges ahead. But for now, he had proven the strength of Earth's ancient ways against even the most formidable of foes. As the rogue leader was escorted back to his ship by his remaining soldiers, the galactic forces rallied, their spirits lifted. They had seen what was possible, had witnessed a glimpse of hope in the midst of chaos. And with that, the Longbowmen knew they were ready for whatever came next. The battlefield lay still for a moment, a tense quiet settling over the shattered landscape. The rogue leader's departure had given the galactic forces a brief reprieve, but every soldier knew it was only temporary. The Longbowman could feel the collective heartbeat of the troops around him, their breaths held in anticipation. They had tasted victory, but they also knew the battle was far from over. The Longbowman lowered his bow and turned to the gathered soldiers. He saw the mix of emotions on their faces: relief, exhaustion, determination. The once chaotic scene had transformed into a fragile calm. He knew he had to speak, to anchor their resolve for the next onslaught that would surely come. "Listen to me," he called out, his voice steady and strong. "What we've done today is more than survive. We've shown that when we stand together, when we adapt and use every skill we have, we can face any enemy." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But this fight isn't over. The rogue faction will return, and they will be more determined than ever. We need to be ready. We need to be united." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and he could see the soldiers straightening, drawing strength from his words. The commanders, who had once dismissed him as a relic of a bygone era, now nodded with respect. They had seen the effectiveness of his leadership, the power of his unorthodox tactics. The Longbowmen knew they would follow him now, not out of obligation, but out of genuine belief. The air grew colder as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the battlefield. The eerie silence was broken by a distant rumble, a low growl that grew louder with each passing second. The ground trembled, and the soldiers tensed, their eyes scanning the darkening sky. "They're coming," the young lieutenant from Altair whispered, her voice barely audible over the growing noise. The Longbowman nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Prepare yourselves," he said calmly. "This will be their final push. They'll throw everything they have at us." The rogue faction's ships appeared on the horizon, dark silhouettes against the fading light. They moved with a terrifying precision, advancing in a tight formation. The air buzzed with energy as the ships powered up their weapons, the hum growing into a deafening roar. The Longbowmen could see the determination in their movements, the resolve to crush any resistance. As the first volley of plasma bolts streaked toward them, the Longbowman raised his bow once more. He fired an arrow into the sky, its arc trailing like a comet. It was a signal, a call to action. The galactic soldiers sprang into motion, each taking their positions, ready to hold the line. The Longbowman's arrows flew swiftly, each one finding its mark with uncanny precision, striking critical targets and disrupting the enemy's advance. But the rogue faction was relentless. Their ships unleashed a barrage of fire, the ground erupting in explosions that shook the earth and sent shockwaves through the ranks. The soldiers gritted their teeth, holding their ground as best they could. The Longbowman moved like a shadow among them, his movements fluid and precise, his eyes never leaving the enemy. The rogue ships pressed closer, their fire intensifying. The Longbowman could feel the heat of the plasma bolts as they passed by, singeing the air. He knew they couldn't hold out forever. They needed to change the tide, to find a way to disrupt the enemy's momentum. "Commander!" he called out to the officer leading the defense. "We need to split their formation. If we can break their line, we can force them into a retreat." The commander nodded, quickly issuing orders to the troops. You heard him. Focus fire on the left flank. We need to create an opening. The soldiers responded, their coordinated efforts shifting the focus of their attacks. The leftmost rogue ship shuddered under the concentrated fire, its shields flickering and then failing. With a roar, it plummeted to the ground, creating a gap in the formation. Now! The Longbowman shouted. Push forward! The galactic forces surged, capitalizing on the opening. They advanced with a newfound ferocity, their movements precise and unified. The rogue faction, caught off guard by the sudden assault, faltered. The Longbowman could see the confusion in their ranks, the hesitation as they tried to regroup. But he knew this was their chance. He drew another arrow, taking careful aim at the rogue faction's command ship. It was a bold move, a gamble, but he knew it was the only way to end this. The arrow flew true, piercing through the ship's weakened shields and striking its core. A blinding explosion followed, engulfing the ship in a ball of fire. The rogue faction's fleet began to waver, their lines breaking as panic set in. The soldiers of the Galactic Alliance pressed their advantage, driving the enemy back with a relentless assault. The Longbowman continued to fire, his arrows finding their marks amidst the chaos. As the rogue forces began to retreat, the Longbowman felt a surge of relief. They had done it. They had turned the tide. The battlefield, once a scene of impending defeat, was now a testament to their resilience and unity. The rogue ships withdrew, their formation shattered, their spirit broken. The galactic soldiers cheered, their voices rising in a triumphant chorus. The Longbowman lowered his bow, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He had come here as a symbol of Earth's ancient traditions, mocked and underestimated. Now, he stood as a warrior, respected by those who had doubted him. He turned to face the soldiers, their eyes filled with admiration and gratitude. We fought well today, he said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of the battle. But remember, this victory isn't just mine. It's ours. We stood together, and that's what made the difference. The soldiers nodded, their spirits lifted. They had faced a formidable enemy and emerged victorious, but they knew there would be more battles ahead. They would need to remain vigilant, to continue working together, to build on the unity they had forged in the heat of battle. As the sun set on the ravaged landscape, casting long shadows over the soldiers, the Longbowman looked out over the battlefield. The horizon was quiet now, the enemy in retreat, but he knew this peace was only temporary. He took a deep breath, feeling the cool night air fill his lungs. They had won this day, but the future still held many uncertainties. And with that thought he steeled himself for what was to come, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead.